History is often written by kings, but it is built by those who belong to them. Imagine a boy, born in a small village in the Balkans. He knows nothing of the world beyond his father's fields. But one morning, the dust of the horizon brings the Sultan's men. He is taken. He is renamed. He is reborn. He is no longer a son of the West. He is a slave of the port. A Janissary. For 400 years, these men were the iron heart of the Ottoman Empire. They were the first professional standing army since the fall of Rome. They didn't just fight for the Sultan, they were the Sultan's well-made flesh. From the slaughter at Kosovo to the apocalyptic fall of Constantinople, their matchlocks and white felt caps were the last thing 1,000 years of Christian kings ever saw. But how did a group of captive children become the most feared military institution on the planet? And how did the Sultan's most loyal hounds eventually become his executioners? Today, we trace the rise, the glory, and the blood-soaked downfall of the Janissary Corps. In the late 14th century, the world was in flux. To the west, the Byzantine Empire was a fading ghost of its former glory. To the east, the Anatolian plains were a patchwork of warring tribes. But under the rising House of Osman, a new kind of power was brewing. The early Ottoman armies were built on the backs of the Ghazis, irregular tribal cavalrymen and holy warriors. They were effective, yes, but they were also fickle. Their loyalty belonged to their clans, not necessarily to the Sultan. Sultan Murad I realized that to build an empire that would outlast his lifetime, he needed a force that belonged to him and him alone. A household guard. The Kapikulu. The solution began with the Pensik system. Islamic law dictated that 1/5 of all war booty belonged to the state. Murad interpreted booty to include human captives. These captured Christian youths were taken, converted, and trained as the first Janissaries. But as the empire grew, the battlefield alone could not provide enough recruits. Thus, the most controversial recruitment system in history was born, the Devshirme. Every few years, Ottoman officials would descend upon the Christian villages of the Balkans. They were not looking for gold, they were looking for talent. The brightest, strongest boys between the ages of 8 and 18 were selected. To the villagers, it was a tragedy. A blood tax. Yet, for many of these boys, it was an invitation to the highest corridors of power in the world. They would leave their plows behind, to become the Sultan's most trusted shadows. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire created a serious problem. Conquest was easy, control was not. New lands meant new people, different languages, different religions, different loyalties. The early Ottoman army was still based on traditional systems, tribal warriors, Ghazi fighters, men who fought for faith or for loot, but these men were unpredictable. They could win battles, but they could not guarantee stability, and for a growing empire, that was dangerous. The Sultan needed something new, an army that would never rebel, never question, never hesitate, an army that belonged only to him, and so, a radical system was created, the Devshirme, a system unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Every few years, Ottoman officials would enter Christian villages in the Balkans. They would gather young boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, not randomly, but carefully. They looked for strength, intelligence, potential. The strongest, the smartest, the most promising, were taken. Families resisted, some tried to hide their children, others begged, but resistance was useless. The boys were separated, forced to leave everything behind, their homes, their language, their identity. For many, it was the last time they would ever see their families again. But this was only the beginning. The boys were transported deep into Ottoman lands, and their transformation began. First, conversion. They were converted to Islam, not just in name, but in culture, in belief, in identity. Then came education. Some of the most intelligent boys were selected for elite training. They were sent to palace schools, where they studied language, administration, politics. These boys could rise to become advisors, generals, even grand viziers. But most were sent down a different path, a harder path. They were placed with Turkish families. where they learned the language, the customs, the discipline of Ottoman life. Years passed, the boys grew into young men, stronger, tougher, completely reshaped, their past identities faded, and in their place, a new identity formed, one built on loyalty, obedience, and purpose. Finally, they were brought together again, not as children, but as soldiers. This was the moment. They became something new, the Janissaries, an elite military corps, unlike anything in Europe. They were not nobles, not mercenaries, not feudal knights. They were the Sultan's personal army, completely separate from the traditional power structures. They did not fight for land, they did not fight for wealth, they fought for one reason only, the Sultan, and that made them incredibly powerful, because their loyalty was absolute. They had no family ties to distract them, no regional loyalties to divide them, only duty, only discipline, only war. This system was ruthless, but it was also brilliant. Because it solved the empire's greatest weakness, control. The Devshirme ensured that the most powerful military force in the empire was also the most loyal. But there was something even more important, something that would define the Janissaries. From the very beginning, they were not just soldiers, they were a new kind of soldier, professional, permanent, disciplined, at a time when most armies were temporary, poorly trained, and unreliable. The Janissaries were always ready, always prepared, always under control, and that difference would change warfare forever, because for the first time an empire had created a standing army that did not depend on feudal lords or temporary alliances. It depended only on itself, and this was just the beginning, because soon these soldiers would face real war, real enemies, and prove why they would become one of the most feared forces in history. The Janissaries were no longer just soldiers. They had become a force, a symbol of power within the Ottoman Empire, feared by enemies, respected by allies, and increasingly feared by their own rulers. For centuries, they stood at the center of Ottoman military success. They fought in major campaigns, expanded the empire's borders, and played a crucial role in victories that shaped history. One of their greatest moments came in 1453, at the siege of Constantinople, under the command of Mehmed II. The Janissaries led the final assault, wave after wave, disciplined, relentless, unbreakable, until the walls were breached and the city fell. It was more than a victory, it was a turning point in world history. The fall of the Byzantine Empire marked the end of an era, and the rise of Ottoman dominance, and at the heart of it all were the Janissaries. After this victory, their influence only grew. They became the backbone of the empire's military. Stationed in the capital, close to the Sultan, close to power, too close, because over time, something began to change. The system that had once made them strong began to weaken, the strict discipline started to fade, rules were relaxed, standards declined, and the Janissaries adapted in a different way. They began to seek comfort, privileges, wealth. They were allowed to marry, to own businesses, to live outside the barracks. At first, these changes seemed harmless. But slowly, they transformed the Janissaries from elite soldiers into a powerful social class. Their identity shifted, their priorities changed, and most dangerously, their loyalty began to shift as well. No longer completely devoted to the Sultan, they began to act in their own interests. They demanded higher pay, better conditions, more influence, and when they did not get what they wanted, they rebelled again and again and again. Sultans were threatened, some were removed from power, others were killed. The once loyal army had become a political force, a force that could make or break the empire. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing. European armies were evolving, new tactics, new weapons, new strategies. But the Janissaries resisted change. They rejected modernization. They refused new military reforms, because reform threatened their power. And so, while others moved forward, they remained the same, and in war, standing still is the same as falling behind. By the 19th century, the situation had become critical. The empire was weakening, defeats were increasing, and it was clear something had to change. Then came a new Sultan, Mehmed II. He understood the problem, clearly, directly, and without illusion. The Janissaries were no longer protectors of the empire. They were its greatest obstacle. Reform was necessary, but reform would not be easy, because the Janissaries would never accept it. So Mahmud II made a decision, a dangerous decision, a final decision. In 1826, he announced the creation of a new modern army, trained in European style, equipped with modern weapons, disciplined, efficient, everything. The Janissaries were no longer. As expected, the Janissaries revolted. They rose in rebellion, marching through the streets, demanding the end of reforms. But this time, things were different. The Sultan was ready. Loyal forces surrounded the Janissary. Barracks, artillery was positioned, and then, the order was given, fire, cannons roared, barracks burned, chaos erupted, thousands of Janissaries were killed, others were captured, executed, or exiled. This brutal event became known as the auspicious incident, a name that masked its true nature, the complete destruction of one of the most powerful military forces in history. In a single moment, centuries of tradition ended. The Janissaries were gone, erased from the empire they once dominated. Their legacy, however, did not disappear, because the impact of the Janissaries was far greater than their end. They had created something revolutionary, a standing army, professionally trained, disciplined, centralized, a model that would later be adopted across the world. They had helped transform warfare from medieval chaos into organized strategy, from feudal loyalty into state control, from temporary forces into permanent armies, and even in their decline, they served as a lesson, a warning, that even the strongest institutions can fall when they resist change, when they seek power over purpose, and when they forget what made them strong in the first place. From stolen children to elite warriors, to kingmakers, to rebels, to victims of destruction, the story of the Janissaries is not just a story of war, it is a story of power, of transformation, and of inevitable decline, because in the end, no force, no matter how powerful, can stand forever.